Tonight on Nation to Nation, Cindy Blackstock says Canada still has a lot of work to do when it comes to on-reserve child welfare, despite a recent settlement.
What I still see from the government is a lot of defensiveness. When a critique comes forward, there's more defensiveness than just a real marshalling of their efforts to fix the problem.
A Toronto lawyer says it is time for a deal over child welfare discrimination against Indigenous kids living off reserve.
Many of them are simply suffering the same forms of destitution as the kids who will benefit from yesterday's settlement.
And a McGill University professor explains Indigenous people have their own unique perspective on the current Mideast crisis.
They see themselves, especially within Canada, with our long-standing relationship with the colonial crown, so the Canadian state versus us as a people, and then seeing the Israeli state versus Palestinian people too.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. On Tuesday, a federal court judge in Ottawa approved a $23 billion deal to compensate hundreds of thousands of First Nations children and families who are victims of a chronically underfunded on-reserve child welfare system. Canada has also pledged $20 billion to fix the entire system. Cindy Blackstock launched a complaint about the issue with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal back in 2007, along with the Assembly of First Nations. She's the Executive Director of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society and joins us today from Winnipeg. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Cindy.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
Minister of Indigenous Affairs Patty Hajdu is calling this deal historic, but you're quoted as saying that discrimination continues. What exactly is still happening?
Well, we're seeing challenges with Canada's compliance with the existing orders, particularly with Jordan's Principle. It's difficult to get through to make a request on their 24-hour line. We're seeing long delays in determining cases, including even in urgent cases. In addition to that, we have some concerns about the way that Canada calculates prevention funding for First Nations children, youth and families, and their approach to capital and to post-majority services.
What should the government be doing here and now to fix the problem?
Although this is the thing, Fraser, is that they actually have solutions on the books, and they've been ordered to implement those solutions. They just got to commit to actually doing it. And we know that governments do complicated things all the time, for example, with the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines and everything else like this. So this can be done. They just have to keep focused and actually get the job done so that they're not hurting another generation of children while they're paying compensation to the generation that they've already hurt.
What do you know about how the $20 billion to fix the on-reserve child welfare system is being spent? It's being spent on programming?
Right. So first of all, the government has not released about 25% of it, which would be really needed by communities in remote areas. And I'm really hoping that they release those funds now, because those communities need those supports for their children and their families, because things cost so much up there. In terms of the prevention funding, it's being rolled out over a 5-year basis, and it has already made a huge difference. I know First Nations agencies have been able to reduce the number of children in care significantly, even over just the last 4 or 5 years, with the aid of holistic and culturally based prevention services. So it's out there, but what we really need to target are the drivers of the the overrepresentation of kids in care. Things like poverty, poor housing, trauma from residential schools, and the addictions and domestic violence that flow from that. That's the real ticket to being able to really address this problem.
Minister Hajdu says there will be a more compassionate method of identifying children and their families who are entitled to compensation. How should this be done?
Well, first of all, one of the good things about this compensation is that there won't be interviews of children or of families. You know, like with the IRS, it causes so much trauma for people going through those details. Instead, as many people as possible will be identified through the Government of Canada's own records, so that you just have to present yourself and then you'd be entitled to compensation. There are others, particularly with Jordan's Principle, where some documentation is required, and we'll have to see what the Class Action Council suggests in terms of moving forward to really minimize the burden on those folks. The most important piece that's still up in the air that we all need to watch for are the supports for victims. And Youth in Care have said, look, give us the supports before, during, and after the compensation, and make sure that we really target those persons who are already in trauma and in crises, and those communities where they're already in crises. Those types of supports absolutely need to be there.
Okay, and in terms of the, of course, compensation package was just approved by a federal court judge yesterday, I guess verbally anyway, so I assume the formal approval will be coming as well. But what should or what can we expect to be happening in the next few months in terms of the compensation package and, I guess, continuing to fix this system?
Yeah, so in terms of compensation, the next big document for everybody to watch for is something called a distribution protocol. That'll lay out, Fraser, when people can expect to receive their compensation and how that compensation will be rolled out. It'll also detail all these supports that are so necessary for victims. That has to be approved by the federal court. So once that document is done, it goes to the federal court. And then after that, the Class Action Council start implementing that plan to begin the rollout of the compensation. In terms of ending the discrimination and making sure it doesn't happen again, well, we just did submissions to the tribunal, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, on the matter, and there's a case conference in early November where the tribunal provide us directions on what some of the next steps are. I'm really committed, especially after hearing the stories of the representative plaintiffs, to honoring their plea to stop with the harms to kids. So that process to me is so important, and we can't keep our eye off the ball. The compensation is very important and historic, but what would even be more historic, Fraser, is raising a generation of First Nations kids, families, and young people who aren't discriminated against by the government.
Right, and I'll just move very quickly to my last question on that, and of course it follows up with, of course you've said that certainly the Prime Minister should give an apology, but no sense maybe apologizing if there's still discrimination going on. It's a big thing, a big movement, I imagine, for these government departments to rethink the way they do things and how they interact with Indigenous children and families. How far away are we from a real change in the system, do you think, of a real culture change so that we don't have these children left out in the cold for lack of and their families, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's something called an expert advisory committee made up of people, you know, that would be known to many of your viewers from different disciplines, and their job is to try to tackle that question. In my view, what I still see from the government is a lot of defensiveness. When a critique comes forward, there's more defensiveness than just a real marshalling of their efforts to fix the problem. That's the big thing that needs to happen. And so that reform of the department is absolutely essential, because when I step back and I think about the compensation that was paid, I think I go back 20 years ago when we documented these inequalities, Fraser. We showed how it was separating families unnecessarily, how it was the lack of implementation of Jordan's principle was harming kids and their families. And the government had the solutions. They just chose not to do it. And by that choice, many children lost their childhoods and some lost their lives. We've seen this repeated pattern where government has solutions and they don't act on them. And that's why we all need to keep our eye on the ball and demand government take action. And when it doesn't do so voluntarily, we need to use peaceful and respectful mechanisms like the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to really force that change.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but as always, thanks for joining us, Cindy Blackstock. Always a pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Coming up, we'll have lawyer David Stearns to talk about another lawsuit regarding Indigenous children living off reserve and child welfare services. Welcome back. There's another big lawsuit looming regarding Indigenous child welfare services. This time it involves Inuit, Métis, and First Nations children living off reserve who aren't part of Tuesday's compensation agreement, but it could involve the same number of children. David Stearns is one of the lawyers working on the case, and he joins me today. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So can you first take us through, I guess, there is a lawsuit that started in Nunavik, the Inuit region in northern Quebec, if I'm correct?
That is correct. That is one of several lawsuits involving what are referred to as the off-reserve removed children. So just to give you a bit of background, yesterday's historic settlement that was approved by the federal court is for the First Nations children only, and it's for those First Nations children who were living on a reserve at the time they were removed from their home, and that flows from the well-known historic decision of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal back in 2016 and their compensation decision from 2019. So the class actions that were settled yesterday and approved by the court were only for those First Nations children living on reserve. The case that you've mentioned is one of several. The one in northern Quebec is one of several cases that have been brought on behalf of other children, other Indigenous children, who were essentially subject to the same forms of discrimination under the provincial systems. So they were not living on reserve, therefore their removals were really the product of Ontario or the other provinces' conduct. And the first such case that was brought was the one that was brought in Quebec, and that one's moving forward. But unlike the case that was approved yesterday for the settlement, there's really been no conversation yet with any of the governments about settling the cases, and that's quite disturbing for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I guess that would be my next question, because of course the lawsuit that was sort of approved yesterday by a federal court judge, of course, was a very long struggle, at least 15 years, really more than that even, just before the compensation was approved this week. Are you hopeful, from what you said, it doesn't sound like it's off to a great start, but are you hopeful this class action may be resolved more quickly?
I'm certainly hopeful. Yesterday's decision was historic, and I want to take a moment to recognize just how important that was in moving the country towards reconciliation. That will benefit tens of thousands of children, hundreds of thousands of First Nations people, but it's not the end of the matter. And one of the things that actually becomes very unfair as a result of that settlement is that the other kids, the First Nations kids who are not living on reserve, who were removed, the Indigenous kids and the Métis kids are simply left out in the cold, literally and metaphorically in a way. Many of them are simply suffering the same forms of destitution as the kids who will benefit from yesterday's settlement. So the cases that are brought in the provinces really cry out for a resolution in the same way as the case that was settled yesterday. Unfortunately, though, there haven't been as many voices expressed in support of those kids. These are Indigenous kids, are every bit as Indigenous as the First Nations kids who will get the benefit of yesterday's settlement, but they just simply lack those great voices that led to that historical settlement yesterday. And that's why I'm pleased to be here to start raising awareness for what we call, and it's euphemistic, we call the off-reserve kids. These are the kids who, and unfortunately, because we're involved in both those cases, we have to talk to a number of these kids, and they, unfortunately, we have to tell them there's no money, there's no compensation for you. And they tell us their stories, their heartbreaking stories, and unfortunately, there's really no compensation, there's no justice yet for those kids. I mean, these are, you remember just a few years ago, you were reporting on stories in Manitoba of just widespread removals. There are so many removals of children that they had to be put into hotels. They were taking all their belongings in garbage bags. It was heartbreaking. These are the stories that we're hearing. These are the kids who are once again left out in the cold. And so we're calling on these governments, the provincial governments and also the federal governments, to come forward in a united fashion and to sit down at the table and to try to find resolution so we can get justice for those kids.
Okay, and as we know, yesterday the compensation just portion was approved as $23 billion, plus there's federal government's pledged another $20 billion to fixing the on-reserve child welfare system. Do you have any idea how much federal and provincial governments may owe as a result of the discrimination that you're pursuing?
Well, what we know is that the numbers of the so-called off-reserve kids whose case has not been settled and for which there really are no negotiations ongoing are similar to the number of kids who were removed from reserve who will benefit from the settlement. There were other aspects of the settlement yesterday as well, notably the Jordan's Principle elements, and I'm not talking about that yet. So I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what the total cost is to remedy the off-reserve kids' cases, but it's going to take a significant amount of money.
And it sounds.
And there's an equal need for reform for the off-reserve kids as well. There's an equal need for that. You mentioned that, and that's very important. That another component of the resolution, not so much of the class actions, but of the Human Rights Tribunal case, is this commitment of the governments to paying $20 billion towards long-term reform and the negotiations that are ongoing. Unfortunately, once again, you contrast that with the situation for the off-reserve kids, and it's once again, they're left out in the cold.
Thanks very much for shedding light on this issue for our viewers, as I know it's still, you're still in the middle of a lot of these things, and I'm sure there's lots of interest out there.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate it, and I'm really appreciating the interest and the level of analysis that APTN provides.
We'll be right back with McGill University professor Veldon Coburn to talk about how Indigenous people are reacting online to the current crisis in the Middle East. Welcome back. From the streets to political debates across every network to social media, it's a hot topic of debate. Where does your support lie in the current Mideast crisis with Israel or those who support Palestinians? After the terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel, Western leaders have been quick to give seemingly unconditional support to the Israeli state. On social media, some are questioning whether Canada should be so quick to give its support to Israel. Veldon Coburn is an associate professor at McGill University, and he's one of the people who have raised some of these questions. He joined the discourse online, and he joins me in our studio today to talk about this. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Veldon.
Thanks for having me, Fraser.
So what was it, I guess, that caught your eye, I guess, in the initial sort of when people started taking sides on this on social media, and in particular with Canadian politicians and how they were sort of reacting to what has been happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip over the last few weeks?
Well, I think there's a sharp division between who we mourn and grieve over for the people that were senselessly butchered because of the massacre by the hands of terrorists, but also those victims who will perish because of state responses to it. So some of the, I guess, reaction was to put support behind the Israeli state, which has sort of a dubious record too in terms of human rights and its treatment of Palestinians, though. So it wasn't, say, the victims of the terrorism per se that we ought to mourn, that we really do, but rather there is some sort of grief that was put towards, unquestionably and uncritically, towards the Israeli state. So for some Indigenous peoples, we understand, or at least view, the situation of the military occupation of Palestinians and the long-standing human rights abuses in what is deemed the world's largest open-air prison as something akin to the colonization of Indigenous peoples here. So there's a little bit of affinity and with people who are under that sort of subjugation as well, that we know that there's an impending perish that they'll suffer as a result of some barbaric terrorism that did senselessly slaughter Israeli citizens. So on the one hand, we ought to mourn and appropriately grieve that senseless slaughter. On the other hand, why should we put ourselves uncritically behind the Israeli state, which I think in many cases ought to be questioned for its own treatment towards Palestinians over the last 70 years.
Now, do you see Canada has enough problems, obviously, with its dealings with Indigenous people, obviously a rocky history. Do you see it as somewhat hypocritical for some Canadian politicians to come out strongly on the side of the Israeli state anyway?
Well, I understand in certain respects, because it was these Israeli citizens who were murdered and died and were butchered and very senselessly in the massacre by the terrorists. But the Israeli state, yeah, I think it is a little bit hypocritical in those terms as well, and especially the last couple days and yesterday where Israel tried to subvert the United Nations, because it is this one large body along with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch that has been critical of the Israeli state's treatment of Palestinians over the last several decades. So in terms of other countries that we deem to be pariah states like Iran, Iraq, North Korea, there are other countries around the world too, but in the same vein, we can't, I guess, just say, well, this state deserves all of our grief and that we differentially grieve the loss of Jewish people senselessly slaughtered, but also forget those Palestinians who are living in, extraordinary militarily occupied territory that is under the thumb of the Israeli state, where there are human rights abuses that are on the scale of unspeakable and unacceptable in Canadian law and international law.
Okay, and of course it's like any debate, especially in the Middle East, people will draw sides, but in this particular issue, a lot of Indigenous people have come out, stated their views on it, including yourself, I guess. Why do you think Indigenous people might be passionate about this particular issue at this time?
Well, they see themselves, especially within Canada, with our long-standing relationship with the colonial crown, so the Canadian state versus us as a people, and then seeing the Israeli state versus Palestinian people too. So it doesn't have anything to do necessarily with Jewish people themselves, because there's a lot of Jews in the world that say, well, the Israeli state doesn't represent me. In the same way that Canadians, our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues, such as yourself, we've been colleagues and acquaintances for many years. I don't hold you personally responsible for the atrocities committed against Indigenous peoples by the Canadian state itself. So we see the exercise of raw power from the government, which is disavowed by Jews and other Israeli citizens across the world. So it's not a monolith that we ought to rally around too, is that the state ought to be critiqued for it. And now we're seeing, especially what can be deemed a disproportionate response to the terrorist attacks, that this carpet bombing of Palestine, where if we are going to grieve for the loss of innocent lives of Israeli citizens in the terrorist attack, what does it say about backing a state that is now killing thousands of Palestinians who themselves are innocent because they're not aligned with Hamas themselves too? So this differential view of grieving and the value of lives, we do see a little bit of a parallel between the human rights that are upheld for many Canadians, whereas, and just historically, the settlement with Cindy Blackstock is saying, like, our children aren't going to suffer from human rights abuses anymore, at least. The judiciary telling the Canadian government, you have to stop doing this. So there are those bonds that transcend a deep gulf. I mean, there is an ocean between us too, but we can see the way that the state, the colonial state, treats them as people in similar fashion to our own legacy of colonialism here in Canada.
It's always a pleasure to have you on our show, and take care.
Thanks, it's a pleasure, Fraser.
That's it for this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.